The US Agency for International Development has officially wrapped up its operations more than 60 years since it was founded. Some of its functions have been transferred to the State Department. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said America's foreign assistance will now be limited and targeted. President Donald Trump began dismantling the agency soon after taking office in January as part of his plan to reduce government spending. Thousands of staff and contractors were fired, while humanitarian aid to some of the world's most vulnerable populations was stopped. USAID was the world's largest humanitarian aid donor. It was founded under President John F. Kennedy in 1961, aimed at financing international development and humanitarian projects around the world. Most of its assistance are focused on global health, humanitarian and disaster relief, as well as economic development and governance. The USAID accounted for more than 40% of all humanitarian aid tracked by the UN in 2024. In 2023, it disbursed nearly $43 billion to countries around the world. Now, joining us live from Accra in Ghana is Dean Karlan, former Chief Economist at USAID. Dean, it's almost unbelievable that the world's most powerful nation doesn't have a global humanitarian aid program anymore. How did we get here?
That's a tough question to answer. It's obviously politics. There's also a disconnect between what USAID was really doing and a lot of the rhetoric around what it was doing that made it vulnerable. And vulnerable in the sense that you don't actually, a lot of the benefits that accrued from what USAID was doing are not felt by everyday people, Americans. And so when people are asked in the United States, what do you think of foreign aid, people assumed it was much bigger than it really was. People thought that we were spending 25% of our budget on foreign aid, and that's just not true. It was actually a fraction of a percent that was spent on foreign aid. When people hear about the specifics of what USAID was doing, then they tended to support them, saving lives, literally. Today there was an article in Lancet that documented over the past 30 or so years, 91 million deaths prevented by USAID work. And yet that's not in the common discourse. And so it was vulnerable to DOGE coming in and wanting to cancel it for political reasons.
Dean, I've been in many countries where USAID has been working. I've seen their work up front. It's not just about the work that they do on the ground, but it's actually selling the idea that America is a force for good in the world. Now, that is something you can't really put a price tag on, particularly given America's less fortunate wars, particularly in this part of the world.
No, that's absolutely true. I think people talk a lot about two basic benefits that come from foreign aid. People talk about the soft power, the building of friendships with other nations and other people. But then there's also just the basic, simple recognition that if you're a generous people and your government represents those people, then the government should be generous too, that they are the representation of the people. And many Americans do care about tragedies around the world, natural disasters, long-term development challenges and poverty, as well as short run. And USAID was representing those people to try to help people around the world who were born into situations less fortunate.
Dean, the US State Department says it's going to take on some of the functions of what USAID did. Are you confident that it can actually do that?
So the folding of USAID into State Department is not in its own right that's not an alarm. In fact, 30 years ago, apparently I wasn't around then in this space, but about my understanding is that the Democrats were actually proposing that and Republicans opposed. So there's a certain fear that it's going to politicize aid, but that's not the real issue. I think the real issue is that the expertise of the people who are within USAID were helping to make sure that aid was actually serving its purpose and doing good things. I only joined USAID 2.5 years ago. I am an academic in my career, and I joined with the idea of helping USAID choose its programs more effectively, which is part of the rhetoric of what we've seen behind at least the argument for why they were shutting down. But in the decision making about what to shut and what to keep and the processes being put in place within state, what's clear is that there is no attention being paid to what actually works and what does not when it comes to spending money on aid to help people in other countries. And that's a critical part. And so we can spend all the money in the world if we choose ineffective things to choose to spend money on. It doesn't really matter how much we spend.
But that's the crux of the problem. Is this idea that perhaps USAID didn't sell its projects back home. It was an entity that really was about foreign aid, but it wasn't really selling what it did to Americans back home, and that's why it was so easy to get rid of.
I think there's a certain element of fairness to that, but I don't know if that's actually right, because at the end of the day, a lot of the arguments made against it were just based on things that weren't true. So in some sense, even if the evidence was out there in more clear ways, that doesn't stop someone else from putting forward false evidence and arguing whatever they want. So I think there's a certain element that what you're saying may be true, but we'll never really know whether a different kind of public campaign would have changed what happened.
Dean Karlan, thank you very much for your thoughts. Very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.